They told her it was an honor. They dressed her in silk so fine it felt like water against her skin, rubbed perfumed oils into her wrists and neck until the scent of jasmine became indistinguishable from her fear. She was 14 years old. The attendants didn't meet her eyes as they worked, their fingers steady, mechanical, practiced. This wasn't their first time preparing a girl for the king. It wouldn't be their last. Outside the chamber, beyond marble walls so thick no sound could escape, an empire stretched from the edges of India to the shores of Greece, 50 million souls bowing to one name. But inside this room, none of that mattered. Here, there were no armies, no gods, no glory. Only a girl whose hands wouldn't stop trembling, and a silence so heavy it felt like drowning. Before we go deeper into what history tried to bury, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching this from. It still amazes me that a story from 25 centuries ago can reach someone sitting exactly where you are right now. Her name doesn't appear in any official record. Persian royal archives, meticulous in their documentation of tribute and conquest, somehow forgot to write down what happened to the daughters born inside the harem walls of Persepolis. Historians would later call this omission deliberate. The Greek chronicler Ctesias, who served as personal physician in the Persian court decades after these events, would reference them only in fragments, veiled in euphemism and diplomatic language. But stone doesn't forget. And neither did the men who finally broke their silence when the cost of truth became smaller than the weight of what they'd witnessed. This is the story of Xerxes I, King of Kings, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire at its absolute zenith, and what he did to the girls who shared his blood. It's not the story they teach in schools, the one about burning bridges and Greek warfare. It's the one whispered in palace corridors, the one that ended an empire not through defeat, but through rot from within. And it begins not with conquest, but with a single terrible question. What happens when a man raised to believe he's a god discovers he can bleed? Xerxes entered the world in 519 BC, born into divinity, not metaphorically literally. Zoroastrian priests proclaimed him the earthly vessel of Ahura Mazda, god of light and order. His father, Darius I, ruled an empire so vast that sunrise in one province meant midnight in another. But size alone doesn't explain what shaped Xerxes. It was the theology of power that twisted him. The Royal Academy at Susa didn't teach humility or philosophy. It taught a single, repeating doctrine. Your will is cosmic law. Your thoughts shape reality. Dissent against you is dissent against creation itself. Every ritual reinforced it. Servants tasted his food first, not just for poison, but as an act of devotion, proof that his sustenance was holy. Courtiers approached him, walking backward, eyes lowered, because to turn away from the divine was sacrilege. No child can grow up in that environment and remain human. His mother, Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, understood power's darker mathematics. She'd survived dynastic purges, watched brothers murder brothers, seen empires fracture over questions of succession. She whispered into her son's ear the lesson that would define him: control everything or lose everything. Love is a vulnerability. Trust is a weapon your enemies will use against you. The only safety is absolute dominion. By the time Darius died and the crown transferred to 20-year-old Xerxes, he'd already internalized the central paradox that would destroy him. To be worshipped, you must be untouchable. To be untouchable, you must possess everything completely. And what you possess completely, you inevitably destroy. His early reign was conquest dressed as theology. When Babylon rebelled, he didn't just crush the uprising. He had the city's ziggurat dismantled brick by brick, its sacred statue of Marduk melted down. The message was clear: your God's answer to mine. In Egypt, priests who resisted Persian authority were impaled along the Nile, their bodies left as warnings that rotted for weeks under the desert sun. He was proving something with each act of brutality: reinforcing the walls of his own divinity with terror. Then came Greece. For Xerxes, the campaign was never purely military. It was theological validation. If he could make the sea itself obey him, and he tried, ordering his men to whip the Hellespont with chains when storms destroyed his first bridge, then he would prove once and for all that nature bowed to his will. He assembled an army so massive that ancient sources claimed it drank rivers dry as it marched. The reality was probably closer to 200,000 men, but the symbolism mattered more than the numbers. At Thermopylae, he won. At Artemisium, he won. But at Salamis, in the narrow straits where numbers meant nothing and strategy meant everything, his fleet burned. Months later at Plataea, his ground forces shattered. The man who called himself the King of Kings watched Greek hoplites freemen, not subjects, break his immortals. For the first time in his life, Xerxes encountered a force that didn't recognize his divinity, reality itself. What returned to Persepolis in 479 BC wasn't the same man who'd left. Courtiers noticed it immediately. His eyes had changed, constantly scanning, searching for enemies in every shadow. He stopped holding public audiences. Delegations from distant provinces waited weeks for meetings that never came. Instead, Xerxes withdrew deeper into the palace complex, into the section called the harem, but which functioned more like a walled city within a city. This is where the story darkens beyond redemption. The harem at Persepolis wasn't unique to Xerxes. It was a Persian royal tradition stretching back generations. But what Xerxes transformed it into was unprecedented. By 475 BC, the complex housed over 360 women officially, countless more unofficially. They came from every corner of the empire. Egyptian girls with kohl-lined eyes, Bactrian beauties, Indian dancers, Lydian nobility reduced to concubinage. The selection process was bureaucratic, methodical. Beauty wasn't enough. Physical examinations checked for scars, measured proportions, tested fertility. Those who passed entered a world they would never leave. 15-meter walls surrounded the complex. Windows were barred from the outside. Eunuchs, men castrated specifically for this purpose, guarded every entrance. Even generals couldn't enter without explicit written permission, sealed with the king's personal sigil. What happened inside those walls was meant to remain invisible to history. But empires can't run on silence alone. Too many people were involved: servants, physicians, the eunuchs themselves. And from their fragmented testimonies, preserved in Persian administrative records and Greek accounts compiled decades later, a horrifying pattern emerges. The daughters born in the harem weren't acknowledged as princesses. They received no names in official genealogies, no ceremonies marking their birth, no prospects for political marriage. They simply existed, raised by mothers who were themselves prisoners. Growing up in a world where the boundaries between family and possession had been erased completely. Xerxes didn't just visit the harem, he obsessed over it. After his return from Greece, he spent increasing amounts of time within its walls, sometimes disappearing for weeks. And as his paranoia deepened, as his sense of divine right calcified into something harder and stranger, his attention began to fix on the girls who reminded him of his own mother, who shared his bloodline, who represented something he could still control when the rest of the world had proven uncontrollable. Mithridates, later called Mithridates in Greek sources, was the chief eunuch of the harem during these years. His role required him to maintain schedules, document visits, coordinate the small army of attendants who kept the complex functioning. Decades after Xerxes' death, in a confession given to conspirators who would use it to justify regicide, Mithridates described what he'd witnessed with a precision that suggests he'd been waiting years to speak. He said the king's behavior changed around 471 BC, where before Xerxes had rotated through concubines with the casual indifference of selecting fruit. He now requested specific girls repeatedly, and increasingly, those girls were younger, daughters of his own previous unions, some barely past childhood. The requests came with elaborate preparations, ritual baths, specific incenses, astronomical alignments. Xerxes had convinced himself that what he was doing was sacred, a divine right of kings that transcended mortal law. The first time it happened, Mithridates wasn't sure what he was witnessing. The girl was 12. She was dressed in ceremonial robes, usually reserved for queens. Her face painted with cosmetics that made her look simultaneously older and more grotesque. When she emerged from the king's chamber hours later, she wouldn't speak. She never spoke again, actually. Within a month, she'd been quietly relocated to a distant temple, officially to serve as a priestess, practically to disappear. But she wasn't the last. The pattern repeated different girls, same ritual, same hollow-eyed silence afterward. Some were kept in the harem, transformed into living ghosts who moved through the marble corridors without making sound. Others vanished entirely, their absences explained away as illnesses or transfers. The mothers, imprisoned in their own quarters, could do nothing. To protest was death. To resist was death. Survival meant complicity, meant pretending not to see, meant becoming part of the machinery that fed their own daughters into the mechanism of imperial power. What's most disturbing isn't the acts, but the system that enabled them. The Persian court, famed for order and law, turned its machinery toward concealing harem atrocities. Physicians used coded language to treat injuries and prescribe herbs for pain, miscarriage, or prevention. Records hid truth in euphemism, unnoticed until modern archaeology exposed it. Priests gave divine justification, declaring Xerxes sacred beyond judgment. To question him was heresy. His daughters, scarred and terrified, became unwilling recruiters, believing compliance meant survival. Trauma turned victims into accomplices, ensuring horror endured systemic, ritualized, and tragically self-sustaining. By 468 BC, even the inner court began to fracture. Artabanus, captain of the royal guard, found himself stationed increasingly near the harem complex. His position required him to hear things, to see things in peripheral vision, to know without officially knowing. Later, in justifying his actions, he described the sounds that came from those chambers at night, not screams. Which would have been honest, but silence punctuated by weeping so muffled it suggested hands pressed over mouths. He wasn't alone in his growing horror. A small circle of nobles, men whose own daughters were approaching adolescence, began to realize that proximity to the throne was no longer protection, it was a threat. If Xerxes' appetites continued expanding, if his divine self-conception kept twisting into darker shapes, eventually their own families would be within reach. Fear, not morality, drives most conspiracies. But sometimes the two align. The plan came together slowly through the early months of 465 BC. Artabanus cultivated relationships with 6 other men, 2 generals, 3 nobles, a priest who'd lost his faith, watching sacred texts twisted to justify evil. They couldn't act openly. Frontal challenge would be crushed, and worse, it would expose the very crimes they needed to keep hidden if the empire was to survive intact. They needed the king alone, vulnerable, and they needed his death to look like something other than murder. August 4, 465 BC, the Persian calendar marked it as a holy night, when the king traditionally withdrew for private communion with divine forces. Xerxes had requested a specific girl be prepared, 11 years old. Daughter of a Median concubine, distinguished only by eyes that reminded him of his grandmother's portrait. The preparation had taken days. She'd been bathed in milk and honey, dressed in silk so thin it was nearly transparent. Taught the prayers she was supposed to recite, though nobody explained what they actually meant. Artabanus knew the palace's secret architecture better than anyone. Beneath the public halls, beneath even the harem's ground level, ran service tunnels where kitchen workers moved supplies and waste unseen. Protocol demanded that eunuchs guard the harem's entrances, but never enter when the king was conducting divine ritual. That gap in security was everything. 7 men entered the tunnels just after sunset. They carried daggers, not swords, weapons that could kill silently, that wouldn't clang against armor or door frames. The passage took 20 minutes, navigating by memory through darkness, barely pierced by guttering oil lamps. They emerged in a corridor adjacent to Xerxes's private chamber, close enough now to hear voices. His voice, thick with wine, and something harder to name. And another voice, younger, pleading in a whisper. Artabanus pushed the door open. What they saw stopped them cold. The King of Kings, the living god of Persia, the ruler of 50 million souls, was naked, drenched in sweat, struggling with a child who'd gone completely limp, dissociated from her own body as a survival mechanism. His face was flushed, eyes wild, mouth moving in prayers that sounded more like curses. For just a moment, the conspirators hesitated, not from fear, but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing divinity revealed as monstrosity. Artabanus moved first. The blade went up under the ribcage, angled toward the heart, a soldier's strike meant to kill instantly. Xerxes turned, and the look on his face wasn't panic, was disbelief. Profound, childlike confusion, as if reality itself had betrayed its fundamental rules. His lips moved. According to Artabanus's later confession, his final words were, "But I am God." The second blade took his throat. The third and fourth were unnecessary, rage finding expression in steel. When it was over, the King of Kings lay sprawled across the marble floor in a spreading pool of blood. His body finally subject to the same gravity as any other man's. They left the girl alive. She never testified, never spoke of that night, vanished into history as thoroughly as her name had been erased from official records. The conspirators moved fast. Xerxes's body was washed, placed in bed, and staged as if he died in holy meditation. By dawn, the empire heard he'd ascended to Ahura Mazda. His son Artaxerxes seized the throne, sealing the harem in honor of his father, really to erase the truth. The women were scattered or silenced, the eunuchs executed under false charges. Mithridates's hidden confession would not surface for 2 millennia. Xerxes's tomb at Nakhshe-Rustam praised him as King of Kings, yet never mentioned the harem. Centuries later, in 1931, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of young female skeletons beneath Persepolis, evidence of horror buried beneath empire and myth. The archaeological report, published in academic journals that few outside specialist circles would ever read, confirmed what Mithridates had written and what palace insiders had whispered. The harem at Persepolis wasn't just a place of exploitation. It was, in its final years, a tomb. Today, tourists walk through Persepolis and photograph the grand staircases, the relief carvings showing tribute bearers from across the empire, the towering columns that once held up cedar roofs. They marvel at the sophistication, the artistry, the sheer ambition of a civilization that could coordinate construction across 3 continents. Few realize they're walking above a mass grave. Even fewer understand that the story of Xerxes isn't really about one man's depravity. It's about what happens when systems, religious, political, administrative, line to protect power instead of people. When divinity becomes a shield for atrocity. When the machinery of state bends itself toward concealment rather than justice. The girls buried beneath Persepolis didn't die from foreign invasion or natural disaster. They died because an entire empire chose to look away. Because priests decided theology was more important than children. Because bureaucrats followed orders that should have been refused. Because mothers, themselves prisoners, couldn't protect their daughters without becoming accomplices. And because a man raised to believe he was a god never learned the one lesson that might have saved them all. That divinity demands humility, not domination. That power without limit is just another word for madness. In the Archaeology Museum in Tehran, there's a small display case that most visitors pass without stopping. Inside is a bronze bracelet, corroded green with age, recovered from the sealed chamber beneath Persepolis. It's sized for a child's wrist. There's no label explaining who wore it, or how she died, or whether anyone mourned her. But if you stand there long enough, if you let yourself really see it, that bracelet becomes something more than artifact. It becomes testimony. Proof that even when empires conspire to forget, even when history buries truth beneath grand narratives and stone monuments, some evidence survives. The girls of Xerxes' harem have no names in any chronicle, but their bones remain pressed into the earth beneath a palace built to celebrate power. And in their silence, they speak a truth that every civilization needs to hear. That glory means nothing if it's built on suffering. That monuments are hollow when they stand on graves. That the real measure of any empire isn't its size or wealth, but how it treats those who have no power to resist it. Xerxes wanted to be remembered as a god. History granted him a different immortality, not as divine, but as warning. A reminder that when we call someone untouchable, when we place any person beyond accountability, we don't create heaven on earth. We create something much closer to hell.